Welcome back to Slabbed Portfolios, the podcast where we break down the biggest comics, collectibles, and action figures so you can collect smarter and avoid costly mistakes. Please make sure you're subscribed to the channel so you don't miss any episodes or any breaking news. Today, we're talking about one of the most interesting Spider-Man related releases to come out this year, and that is the new Spider-Man Noir series that just released on May 25th, 2026, just a few days ago. And what makes this one particularly interesting isn't just that it exists or even how it was marketed, but how quickly it has already started to shape conversation around Spider Man as a character again. Because anytime you take a character like Spider Man and place him in a completely different tone, setting, and visual identity, the collector market tends to react in very predictable ways, even when it's a variant version like Noir. Now, Spider-Man Noir has always been one of those alternate interpretations of Peter Parker that collectors respect, but it's never been the mainstream version, right? I think we can all agree about that. We know what it is, but it's never been mainstream. It's darker, it's more grounded, set in a period style crime environment, and it leans heavily into detective storytelling rather than the traditional bright, witty Spider-Man tone that most audiences are used to. And this new series seems to fully commit to that identity. From early reports and viewer reactions since release, the show is leaning heavily into that noir crime structure. We're talking shadows, corruption, organized crime storylines, and a much more grounded version of Spider Man in a morally gray world. It's less about quipping and superhero spectacle and more about investigation, survival, and navigating a city that feels dangerous in a very human way. That tonal shift is one of the biggest reasons people are talking about it. Now, in terms of casting, the performance discussions so far have centered around how the lead actor brings a more restrained, almost hardened interpretation of Peter Parker. And by lead actor, I mean Nicolas Cage. Instead of the usual energetic, youthful Spider Man portrayal, this version feels older, more methodical, and much more focused on observation than reaction. That matters because tone defines how audiences emotionally connect with a character, and early audience reception seems mixed but very engaged. Some viewers love the darker direction and stylistic approach, while others feel it strays too far from traditional Spider Man energy. But regardless of opinion, the key point for collectors is that people are watching it. And more importantly, people are talking about Spider Man again in a slightly different way. And that's where the comic market always starts to pay attention. Because whether reception is overwhelmingly positive or slightly divided, the important factor for collectibles is visibility. When a character is in the cultural conversation again and again, like Spider Man is right now, the demand for their core legacy books tend to strengthen over time. Now, when we talk about Spider Man in terms of blue chip comics, there are really only a few books at the top of the hierarchy that define the entire character's collectible identity. The first and obviously the most important is Amazing Fantasy number 15. This is the origin point, the first appearance of Spider Man, one of the most important comic books ever printed in the history of the medium. There's no real debate around its status at this point. It exists in the top tier alongside a very small group of books that define entire genres of collecting. And I am pretty much talking about Golden Age stuff, Superman 1, Batman 1, that kind of thing. AF15 is up there in terms of desirability. It might not be as expensive, but people want that book. And what's interesting about Amazing Fantasy 15 in situations like this is that it doesn't need direct adaptation relevance to be affected by Spider Man media. It moves on cultural relevance alone. Every time Spider Man appears in a new major adaptation, whether it's live action or animation or whatever, especially one that introduces him to new audiences or reinterprets him in a different tone, like we have going on right here, it reinforces the importance of the character's origin. It sends new viewers backward through the history of Spider Man, and eventually, all roads lead to Amazing Fantasy 15. Now, most collectors are not going to own that book, but it acts like a gravitational center for the entire Spider Man market. When Spider Man is hot culturally, AF15 becomes even more important symbolically, even if it's already at the top of the market structurally. Now, the next major pillar is Amazing Spider Man number 1. Now, I may be biased here. I happen to like Amazing Spider-Man #1 over AF15. I happen to like the cover better. I think it's a cooler book. I remember years ago, people really wanted ASM1 more than AF15 at cons and stuff like that. Obviously, those days are long behind us, but that's my opinion. I happen to like ASM1, but to each their own. ASM1 is where Spider Man transitions from origin concept into an ongoing universe. This is the beginning of the Rogues Gallery expansion. It's the establishment of supporting characters and the foundation of what becomes the long term Spider Man mythos. And ASM1 tends to behave differently than AF15. It's still a blue chip book, but it's more sensitive to collector cycles. When Spider Man is actively in the cultural spotlight, ASM1 often sees increased attention because it represents the start of everything continuing. It's not just who Spider Man is, it's what Spider Man becomes. And that distinction matters a lot in collector psychology. Now, when a show like Spider-Man Noir releases, it doesn't directly adapt those blue chip books, but it reinforces the broader idea that Spider-Man is a flexible, evergreen character, one that can exist in different eras, tones, and interpretations. And that flexibility is one of the reasons Spider-Man keys have historically maintained strong demand across multiple generations. Because every new version of Spider-Man expands the audience base. Even people who don't normally read comics start engaging with the character again. They revisit older films, they search online for origin information, and eventually some percentage of that audience becomes curious about the original comics that started it all. And that curiosity is where demand begins. Now, the interesting thing about Spider-Man Noir specifically is that it doesn't dilute the main Spider-Man identity. Instead, it expands it. It adds another layer to the mythology without replacing anything. And in collecting terms, that's actually very important. Because expansion driven adaptations tend to lift all boats, especially at the top of the market. When a character is reinterpreted successfully in a new format, it strengthens the perception that the original character is versatile, timeless, and culturally relevant. In other words, the success of this show is a net positive for Spider Man in general. That perception feeds directly into blue chip comic demand. Now, early reception of the series, based on viewer reactions so far, seems to be centered around the tone. People are acknowledging the stylistic direction, the darker atmosphere, and the attempt to reframe Spider Man within a noir crime setting. And even when reviews are mixed, the key takeaway for collectors is that the show is generating discussion. And discussion is what keeps characters alive in the market, because comics don't just move on quality, they move on attention cycles. If Spider Man is trending in any form, whether it's mainstream MCU films, animated interpretations, or alternate universe storytelling like noir, it keeps the character active in the cultural bloodstream. Now, from a collector standpoint, the important thing to understand is that blue chip Spider Man books don't need direct plot relevance to benefit from these cycles. AF15 is not going to suddenly spike because Spider Man Noir has a storyline that mirrors it. That's not how this works. Instead, what happens is subtler. The character becomes more visible, more discussed, more searched, more referenced, and that increased visibility strengthens long term desirability. It doesn't always show up as immediate dramatic price movement. Sometimes it shows up as tighter supply, fewer listings, stronger auction participation, and more hesitation from existing owners to sell. That's often the first sign that a character's market is strengthening again. Now, another thing worth noting is that Spider Man as a property has one of the strongest track records in all of comics when it comes to media driven reinforcement cycles. Every major Spider Man film or series doesn't just create a spike. It creates a renewed baseline level of interest in the character, and over time, those baseline resets accumulate. That's part of why books like AF15 and ASM1 have remained so structurally strong across decades. They are continuously reinforced by new adaptations introducing Spider Man to new generations, and Spider Man Noir, even though it's a variant interpretation, still contributes to that ecosystem. It reminds audiences that Spider Man is not a single story, he's a framework, a mythology that can be reinterpreted endlessly while still remaining recognizable at its core. And that kind of narrative flexibility is extremely powerful for long term collector psychology. Because collectors aren't just buying comics, they're buying permanence, they're buying cultural stability, they're buying the idea that a character will still matter decades from now, and Spider Man consistently reinforces that idea. Now, if we zoom out and think about what actually drives value in blue chip comics during media cycles, it usually comes down to three things. The first is awareness, more people thinking about the character. The second is emotional connection, people engaging with the new version of the character and developing attachment. And the third is historical curiosity, people wanting to understand where it all started. This series contributes strongly to the first two, and indirectly, that fuels the third. Because once people are emotionally engaged with the character, they start exploring deeper layers of that character's history. And that's when books like AF15 and ASM1 re enter the conversation in a meaningful way again. Not because they were ever irrelevant, but because attention cycles bring them back into focus. Now, I don't think this series alone is going to redefine the Spider Man market. That's not how blue chip comics move. And not only that, we have a huge Spider Man movie that's coming out this summer, and I expect a lot more activity with that than I do with this. But what it can do is reinforce an already extremely strong foundation. And in collectible markets, reinforcement matters just as much as innovation, because these top tier Spider Man books don't need explosive growth cycles to remain important. They just need consistent cultural relevance, and Spider Man as a character continues to provide that through every new adaptation, including alternate versions like Noir. So when we look at the broader picture, Spider Man Noir isn't just another show, it's another reminder that Spider Man is one of the most enduring characters in modern storytelling. And every time that reminder appears in popular culture, the foundation of Spider Man collecting becomes just a little bit stronger. Thanks for listening to the Slabbed Portfolios podcast. I hope this information continues to help you, and I will see you guys on the next one.